I didn't know what else to do. I had just graduated, a diploma shining on the wall of an empty apartment, and the beads began to weigh like a rock over my chest. I send resumes, I spend days waiting for answers that never come, and the feeling of being sinking only increases. It was then that one night, a message appeared on my phone. It was simple, without great explanations, just a job offer, night security, private cemetery. The salary was much more than I expected, more than I imagined I could earn in a whole month, but the location and nature of the work made me hesitate. I looked at the screen of my phone and wondered, why would a cemetery need security at night? It was not normal someone needed guard in such a quiet, isolated place. But the money, the money seemed like a call, like a lighthouse in the middle of the storm. I really work, so I answered. They gave me the address and instruction to arrive at night, after 10 a.m. The cemetery was not large, but it seemed to have an air of mystery that came out of those silent hills. When I got there, the first thing that caught my eye was the atmosphere. The place had something old, but not in a nice way. The tombstones were arranged in an organized way, but many excuses were spent by time, covered with moss, cracks in some, names that were no longer legible. The trees around were tall, but the feeling of isolation was overwhelming. What bothered me most, however, was the silence. There was no sound of birds, no rustling of leaves, no wind touching the trees. Nothing. Only absolute emptiness. I was greeted by a vague figure, a man in a dark uniform and a face that I could not identify very well in the penumbra. He pointed me to a building on the edge of the cemetery, a small wooden room that served as a central surveillance. The place looked worn but functional. The moment I walked in, I went straight to the point, picking up the uniform and putting it on quickly. The supervisor told me the rules. Without looking me in the eye, these rules were etched into my mind. They were simple but weird. Do not speak to anyone. Do not interact with visitors. Do not leave the enclosed area. Stay on the path and in the rounds. Be punctual. Nothing but that. What made me most uncomfortable was the way he looked at me when he said the last thing. As if I was expecting some occurrence from me. I merely nodded my head and prepared for the first round. He handed me a flashlight and, without further explanation, left me alone. I did not understand very well what they expected of me, but the silence of the cemetery bothered me in an indescribable way. The sound of my own steps seemed amplified in the dead of night. As he walked between the tombstones, he noticed that although the place was vast, there was no one around. The cemetery seemed more an extension of the emptiness that surrounded me. When I gave the first round, the cemetery seemed to have no end. I stopped from time to time to check that everything was in order, but nothing seemed out of place. There were no people, there were no children. Only the vast darkness and that strange emptiness. During the second round, I felt myself looking at the names on the tombstones, almost as if they let me call, with those words erased by time. The impression was that I was in a place that was no longer belonging to this world. That feeling does not leave me. The more I walked, the more it seemed that I was being watched, not by people, but by something far beyond my comprehension. I didn't know what it was, but something inside me said that the cemetery wasn't just a resting place for the dead. I was there, alone, in the darkness, with the feeling that something or someone was waiting to show me this. I finished my first round with a feeling of restlessness that I can't explain. When I returned to the room, the supervisor was no longer there. I stood there alone, looking at the shadows that moved outside the window, feeling a weight in my chest that I could not save. It was not the cemetery that bothered me, it was the emptiness. The emptiness was oppressive and deep, as if it itself were a kind of presence that watched at all times. The hours passed slowly, and all I could do was wait. Another night began, and with it, another round. But, contrary to what I imagined, something inside of me already knew that it would not be a night like the others. Something was about to happen. The clock in the room marked midnight, and the silence seemed even heavier. I was there, alone, sitting in an uncomfortable wooden chair, eyes fixed on the window, watching the shadows dancing in the wind. I knew I should be doing my rounds, but something held me back. The graveyard at night had a strange power over me. It was not as I imagined. There was simply no calm of a place where the dead rest. There was something else, something that could not be described, as if the graves themselves held secrets, stories that should never be revealed. My head was full of questions, but I didn't know if I should try to answer some of them. What would I do if I found something in the cemetery? How would I react if I saw something out of the ordinary? I didn't know, but the fear grew inside me, an uncomfortable feeling that I was not alone. It was then that I saw something strange. At first, I thought it was just the light of the lantern reflecting in the wrong way on the stones. But as I approached one of the older bottles, I realized one of the tombstones was different. There was no one there, but I could have sworn that something changed every time I looked at her. It was a simple, worn-out headstone with the name almost unreadable. Something seemed strange in the way the lantern light hit it, as if there was something more behind. Went there, trying to keep calm. The wind was stronger now, and the trees along were shaking with a muffled noise. When I got close, I saw what made me stop breathing for a moment. There was freshly removed earth around the tombstone. I knew that no grave had been recently opened. And yet, there she was, visibly dislocated, as if something had been done there, something that should not be done. I stood still, staring at the floor, with a strange feeling growing in my stomach. The whole cemetery now looked different, as if the place itself had begun to move around me. I looked around, trying to see more, but the environment was closed, dark. The sound of wind and leaves seemed muffled, as if the air itself was being compressed. My hands began to sweat, and fear took hold of me, stronger than any fatigue or doubt. I crouched slowly, watching the earth rocking. Then something made me freeze. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible. A sound coming from under the ground, as if someone was down there. The clawing of nails scratching the ground. I got up and took a step back, breathing fast. My mind was starting to throw tricks at me, I knew it, but the sound seemed too real to ignore. I looked away, trying to rationalize. It was impossible. It couldn't be anything. But for a moment I swear I saw a shadow move along near the cemetery gate. A dark, inaccurate figure disappearing among the trees as if it was watching me. The fear paralyzed me, but not for long. I knew I had to keep my composure. I could not help but dominate myself. I took a deep breath and started walking towards the entrance of the cemetery, but the sound continued, persistent. When I passed the iron gate, the noise was gone, as if something or someone had withdrawn to where it should not be. When I returned to the room, I was worried because the cemetery seemed so alive, so attentive to every move. The silence was absolute, but somehow it became something more, a presence that I observed, analyzed me. I knew that whatever was there, lurking in the shadows, was not simply a construction of my mind. The clock struck 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was still standing at the window. The fear that I felt was not something that could be easily explained. It was not the feeling of being in a place of death, it was not just isolation. It was as if the cemetery had a consciousness, a memory, something that should not be discovered, but at that moment seemed to want to show me something. I went back to my post and looked around. There was no more sound, there was nothing left. But inside me, I felt something was about to happen. Something I could not understand. And as much as I tried to deny, the cemetery seemed to be calling me to see something that was buried there for a long time. I didn't know what, nor why. But one thing was certain, the night was far from over, and the cemetery still held something I could not understand. The clock had not yet struck at 3 o'clock, and I was again standing by the window. The cemetery seemed more distant, as if the night began to extend in an endless way. The wind was outside, but what bothered me most was not the cold or the sound of dry leaves crawling on the ground. What bothered me was the feeling that something was watching me. Something that was there, but I could not see. I knew that I should follow my routine, rounds, keep watch, make sure everything was in order. But every time I passed by one of the oldest graves, a strange feeling took me, as if an invisible presence was following me. I caught myself turning around several times, as if I was expecting to find someone behind me, but I was always alone. The cemetery seemed too big for one person, and that's what made me nervous. Oh, empty. Oh, echo. I was at the end of my second lap, almost reaching the gate again, when I heard him. A low sound, almost like a sigh. As if someone was trying to get my attention without me noticing. It seemed to come from the bottom of the cemetery, from where the tombs were older, darker, where shadows take over. I froze. That part of the cemetery always gave me a chill, especially at night. The gravestones, spent by time, justify more ghosts than stones. And the strangest of all, this part of the cemetery never seemed to be as quiet as the others. It was as if the place itself had life, or at least, as if there was something moving between the tombs, waiting for the right time to be seen. I didn't want to go there. Everything inside me cried out to stay where I was, not to approach that corner, but an invisible force seemed to pull me. It was no longer just curiosity or fear. It was a feeling, a need to understand what was happening. Something inside me knew that if I didn't go there, I would never be able to live in peace. Then, without thinking twice, I started walking towards the oldest part of the cemetery. The path to there was narrow and tortuous, full of bushes and very thick trees stretch out to touch me. I felt the eyes of the angel statues watching me, and the sound of wind in the dry leaves sounded like whispers. I felt observed, watched, and the more I walked, the more the feeling intensified. As if something was coming closer, getting closer and closer. When I reached the first ancient tombstones, the light of the lantern began to flicker, as if the darkness itself was trying to swallow the light. Then I saw. In the far corner, almost out of reach of my flashlight, something moved. It was not an ordinary shadow. It was a shape, a silhouette that did not belong to the night. She looked human, but something was wrong. There was something that made me want to turn and run, but I was paralyzed. The figure moved with an impossible agility, sliding between the tombstones, as if it was approaching, watching. Fear corrodes me, but at the same time, something stronger prevents me from leaving. It was as if that presence was calling me, attracting my attention. I did not know what it was, nor what I wanted. The figure kept moving, but always kept away, as if expecting something. I took one step forward, then another, until I was right in the center of that forgotten space of the cemetery. The lantern was tremendous in my hands, and the sound of the wind seemed to have disappeared completely. The only thing I could hear now was my own heart, beating wildly. I looked everywhere, trying to find the origin of that presence. But the figure disappears. I was about to turn and run away, but something stopped me. On the ground near the base of one of the oldest tombstones there was something. It was not a stone, nor a branch. It was a torn piece of tissue, bloodied. I bowed instinctively, stomach racked, but could not contain the curiosity. It was a piece of clothing, something so worn and dirty that it could hardly be distinguished from the ground. I didn't know what I was thinking when I approached, but when I touched the fabric, the feeling of cold was instantaneous. It wasn't just the cold of the night. It was a feeling of despair, as if something very old had been awakened. The terrible feeling of being borrowed returned, stronger than ever. I turned quickly, trying to see what was behind me, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness that was crawling between the graves. I took a deep breath, trying to control the anxiety that was beginning to take hold of me. The cemetery now looked like a maze of shadows and mysteries, and I no longer knew what was real. Before I could take any action, I came back. It was the whisper, louder now. Something or someone was calling my name. I tried to ignore it, but the sound intensified, mixing with the wind as if it were coming from all sides. The dread took hold of me. There was no more room for doubts or explanations. Something was happening there, something I could not understand. I quickly moved away, feeling the weight of the night pressing on my body. The cemetery seemed to close around me, each step echoing louder than the previous one. When I finally reached the gate, the inspiration ceased, but the shiver that ran through my spine. I can no longer see the place in the same way. The cemetery had become something different. Something I no longer knew I wanted to understand. In the following days, I tried to keep going with the routine, but the feeling of discomfort did not leave me. The cemetery, which was once a lonely and quiet place, now seemed like a strange terrain, as if it were loaded with an energy that I could not understand. Every night was a torment, and the more time I spent there, the more I felt as if I was being consumed by something invisible. I tried to rationalize what happened, but the truth is that I knew what I had seen that night was unexplainable. I still did not know what was that figure moving between the tombstones, or what the piece of cloth contained, but something told me that I should not continue to investigate. However, deep down, a growing curiosity pushed me to find out more. Something told me that if I didn't face it head-on, I would never be able to live in peace. And it was that night, when the sky was starless, and the moon almost did not light the way, that everything intensified. During my first round, everything seemed normal. The cold wind, the darkness filling every corner of the cemetery, and the silence that now seemed heavier. But something was different. I could feel it. It was as if the earth under my feet was vibrating, subtly, as if it were responding to my presence. I hesitated for a moment, but I went ahead. The oldest part of the cemetery looked darker that night, as if the gravestones were bending to swallow me. I was near those tombs when I heard it. The soft sound, like the sound of gentle steps on damp ground. There was no wind, nothing that could justify that something. I froze, and my heart began to beat faster. The sound keeps getting closer and closer. I looked around, trying to see where it came from. The shadows moved with a strange fluidity, and I knew I was not alone. Something was fine. Something or someone. That's when I saw her. She stood between the tombstones, in silence. A girl. He didn't seem to be more than 8 or 9 years old, but his face was pale, almost translucent, as if he were floating in a state between the world of the living and the world of the dead. She wore a simple dress, of white cloth, dirty and worn, and her long and dark hair fell on her shoulders, entangled. Her eyes were fixed on me, but there was no life in them. They were empty eyes, as if the girl was more a shadow than a real person. I wanted to scream, run, but something kept me from moving. The fear took hold of me, and I knew I should not be there. But at the same time, I can't look away. Something was holding me to her. She stepped towards me, her bare feet touching the ground with a muffled sound, without making any noise. His movements were slow, smooth, as if floating on the ground. When I was a few meters away from me, the girl stopped, and it was as if time had stopped too. The silence took over the environment, so dense that you could feel. I knew something was about to happen, something I didn't want but couldn't help. The girl reached out her hand slowly, pointing to one of the more distant tombstones. It was an old tombstone, covered with moss, and the name engraved on it was almost erased by time. I could not see clearly, but the feeling that there was something wrong with that stone was unmistakable. I knew that I should ignore, turn, and run away from there, but an invisible force made me walk in the direction it pointed. Each step seemed heavier than the previous one, as if the earth was preventing me from continuing. When I got to the tombstone, I stopped. Something was wrong there. The name on the stone was almost illegible, but there was a clue. I could not clearly identify the year, but a cold ran through my spine when realizing that the data coincided with the year of my own childhood. What was going on? I knew that stone should not be there. The shadows around me shook, and I looked back, but the girl was no longer there. She had disappeared, as if she had never existed. I touched the stone, and at the moment my hand came in contact with the cold stone, the ground below me seemed to shake, and the air became dense, suffocating. A presence enveloped me, as if the whole cemetery was rising, holding me in the center of its ancient curse. The message came back, stronger, more urgent. I no longer knew what was real. The cemetery, the girl, the tombstone, the feeling that something had been awakened, all this mixed in my mind, and I was lost. Fear consumed me, but at the same time I could not stop looking at the tombstone. Something told me that I needed to understand what was there, understand what that place was trying to tell me. But what I didn't know was that, by doing this, I had taken a definite step towards something that had no way back. Something was beginning. Something was about to be revealed. The night dragged on like an eternity, and I could not escape the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to continue my rounds, but my steps were heavier, my breathing harder. The cemetery, which once seemed a familiar and even comforting place, now became a hostile territory where every shadow seemed to have its own life, and each noise, however soft it was, made my heart soar. I knew that tombstone, that forgotten old tomb, was calling me. But what bothered me most was not the gravestone itself, but the feeling that it was connected to me in some way. I was never superstitious, never believed in ghosts or curses. But that night, I could not deny what was happening around me. The atmosphere was being transmitted from a presence that I could not comprehend, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it intensified. I went back to the main gate, where the wind made the dry leaves dance on the ground. But looking at the shrubs and the shadows of the trees, I saw something moving. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a simple breeze. I knew what it was, but my mind refused to accept. There was something there, moving, silent, like a shadow that should not be there. My mind convinced me that it was just a reflection of my own paranoia, but my body knew it wasn't. I took a deep breath and moved forward, but the sound of my steps seemed muffled, as if the ground wanted to swallow every movement. It was then that a figure appeared before me in the darkness. I couldn't see clearly at first, but something in her posture, the way she stood there, made me stop immediately. It was a girl. She was no longer among the tombstones, but in the middle of the way, with her eyes fixed on me. She did not speak, did not move, but seemed to be watching me with an intensity that made me feel as if I was being dismissed before her. I wanted to run, get out of there, but something stopped me. I was paralyzed, as if it were impossible to escape. The silence between us extended, and yet it seemed that an invisible force connected us. The girl took a step, and suddenly the shadows around her moved in a strange way. It was as if the cemetery itself were reacting to their presence. The trees swayed, but there was no wind. The gravestones trembled, and I could hear the low sound of something crawling on the ground. She didn't say a word, but I could feel something was about to happen. My mind restrained so that I would run away, so that I would leave everything behind, but my feet were frozen, unable to move. The girl then screamed to her hand, as if calling me. His skin was more translucent, paler, and his eyes, empty as darkness, reflected the moonlight in a manner that looked macabre. She started walking towards me, and I could not resist anymore. My mind screamed, but my body seemed to obey a force beyond my control. Every step she took seemed to make the ground tremble, and the shadows on the tombstones danced hypnotically as if they were preparing for something. When she came near me, the shadows were completely wrapped in, and for a moment she disappeared. But it was only for a moment. In the place where she was, one of the tombstones had risen as if it were alive, and the earth around her was getting confused, as if something was trying to emerge from there. The feeling of pavement intensified, and the earth seemed to be vibrating, pulsating. I knew it should not be there. Knew that what was happening was not normal, it was not something I could understand. But the presence of my little girl, and the strange force that seemed to be unfolding around me, prevented me from acting. It was when the headstone broke, and something called from inside of it. It was not a person, but a figure of shadows, a dark silhouette that seemed composed of nothing but pure darkness. Its contours formed and crumbled in a frightening way, as if they were made of the night itself. The figure is sitting before me, and a sense of despair takes over my whole being. I knew that I was facing something that was not human, something that should not exist. The fear paralyzed me completely, and all I could do was look at the figure, which now seemed to move in my direction. The air around me became dense, heavy, and a feeling that time had slowed down took hold of me. I knew I could not run away. There was nowhere to go. The cemetery was now a maze of shadows and terror, and I was trapped in the center of it, at the mercy of what inhabited it. The dark figure was in front of me now, and the fear that I would feel it take physical forms, squeezing my chest like an invisible hand. I couldn't breathe properly, my legs were cold, and all I wanted to do was get out of there, but my legs didn't respond. I was stuck, totally motionless, while the shadow before me seemed to approach with a disturbing calm, as if it were evaluating me. I tried to scream, but the voice didn't come out. It was as if something had cut my throat, making it impossible even to make a sound. The air around me was heavy and thick, as if the cemetery itself was absorbing everything around me, consuming me gradually. The shadow figure seemed to materialize more every second, as if the darkness was taking shape and life. Its outline, indefinite and changeable, made me feel as if I was facing something indescribable, something beyond human comprehension. I didn't know what it was, but what I knew was that it wasn't good. And then a voice, soft and distant but as clear as the sound of a doorbell in the middle of the night, whispered in the depths of my mind. You already knew. It was a female voice, but not human. It had no emotion or warmth. It was as if it had been created from its own emptiness. I tried to ignore, tried to block, but the words echoed in my mind in a way that made me want to fall on my knees, as if there was no more strength in my body. You already knew that this place was not what it looked like. That death was never an end. The voice was like a poison, infiltrating every thought, becoming stronger every second. The cemetery, the silence, the loneliness, everything was beginning to fit into a pattern that I did not want to see, but that was already there, exposed before me. I felt an immense weight on my shoulders, as if a forbidden truth was about to be revealed, a truth that I did not want to hear, did not want to understand. I tried to look at the figure in front of me, but something prevented me from doing it directly. It was as if my own eyes gave me an unbearable pain, as if the sight of that thing was capable of tearing my soul. But I knew I needed to look. I needed to understand what was going on. I took a deep breath, forcing my eyes to stay on the figure. The dark outline that once seemed hazy and distant was now more defined. I could see what seemed to be a head, though faceless, a floating and indistinct body, as if it were made of liquid shadows, always changing, always dissolving and reorganizing. I could feel the girl's presence still around, but she was no longer in front of me. She was, somewhere. Watching. Waiting. But the figure that was now in front of me was not her. It was no longer a child. It was something much older, much darker. The voice echoed again, this time louder, like a distant thunder approaching. You have been chosen. I felt a cold chill run through my spine, and the reality around me began to distort. The cemetery was no longer what I knew. The gravestones began to move, as if they wanted to rise from the ground. The earth around me moved, as if it wanted to swallow me. And in the midst of that chaos, I saw what I feared most: figures, human shadows, rising from the earth, walking towards me. They were the dead, the forgotten, those who were buried without name, without memory. They came in silence, without a sound, but their empty eyes looked at me with an intensity that made me feel as if I was being pulled into the abyss. I wanted to run, but I knew there was nowhere to go. I had no strength. I was physically, emotionally, spiritually exhausted. The cemetery was becoming a place of nightmare, where the laws of life and death were broken. The shadows were becoming an extension of myself, a part of my being, and I no longer knew what was real. The figure in front of me, the shadow figure, began to approach again, but now she did not seem so far away. She seemed so close that I could feel her presence in every cell of my body. I knew what was happening. Knew what they wanted from me. Death, which before seemed something distant, something I feared but did not understand, was now at my door, watching me with empty eyes and waiting for me to accept his invitation. I looked at the ground, desperate, and saw the earth open before me, like a mouth that called me inside. A shiver took hold of my body while the sound of something crawling in the earth echoed in my ears. I wanted to fight, I wanted to run, but I knew there was no more strength for it. The shadow in front of me leans, and I saw an opening, a chasm, a way to another place. I knew that at that point my choice no longer mattered. Death had already marked me, and now I was just waiting for the moment to be taken away. I could no longer distinguish reality from illusion. The cemetery no longer seemed a concrete place, but an extension of my own mind, a space where time did not exist and the rules of life and death were flexible, malleable. I was lost, not knowing whether I was awake or dreaming, if my mind was still intact or had already been consumed by the darkness that took shape around me. The dark figure remained in front of me, but she was no longer just a shadow. As the distance between us narrowed, I could feel the pressure of his presence. The voice that resounded in my mind was now more insidious, stronger, like a distant cry that crossed the fog and infiltrated my consciousness. Every word was like a blade cutting my soul. You can't escape. I tried to move, I tried to run, but my legs were like cast iron. There was no movement. There was no escape. Only the feeling of being pulled into a deeper and deeper abyss, a darkness that became more dense every second. The dead, those who came out of the tombs and were dragged through the land, came more and more. I now saw them, no longer as indistinct figures, but as hungry and distorted faces, beings of bones and rotten flesh, walking with a purpose, as if it would put me waiting to take me where I did not want to go. The sound of his footsteps on the ground was the only sound I could hear, muffling even the rushing beat of my heart. Why me? Why here? The words came out of my mouth, but there was no one to hear. The answer came from where I least expected it. You have been chosen. The voice, cold and distant, seemed to emerge from the ground itself under my feet. I looked down, and saw that the earth was opening. The ground cracked, revealing a deep black rift that extended throughout the cemetery. It was as if the cemetery itself were swallowing the world around it, and the darkness, like a big mouth, wanted me to swallow too. The air was heavier, denser, as if life itself were being removed from the environment. I feel my body weakened, each breath harder than the previous. I was being swallowed up by that darkness, my vision starting to fail, the light around me slowly fading. The figure before me moved even further, now so close that I could feel the cold of his presence. It was not a normal cold, but a cold that penetrated my bones, in my guts. A feeling of imminent death. And I knew somehow that the choice I feared to make was no longer mine. The fate had already been sealed. There was no turning back. I looked at the girl, who was now beside me. She was no longer smiling. Her gaze was empty, lost. And I knew, without her saying a word, that she was no longer part of the same world as me. It was part of the approaching darkness, a manifestation of that terrible and eternal thing now surrounding me. The earth around me kept shaking, as if being dragged to a place I did not know, a place where I could not reach. I knew there was no more escape, that there was no more escape. The abyss before me was the end of it all. The end of me. The last thing I saw was the shadow stretching out over me, the darkness closing in like a giant hand, and I no longer knew if I was alive, if I was dying, or if I was already somewhere else, in a state between life and death, where the borders were tenuous and reality dissolved. Everything is gone. And for a brief moment, I felt a strange peace, as if I was finally finding my place. Woke up. Or at least I thought I did. But there was no light. The world was shrouded in dense and impenetrable darkness, and I could not discern whether I was in a dream or in a real nightmare. The silence was absolute, as if even the sound had been swallowed up by the darkness itself. I tried to move, but my body was heavy, paralyzed, as if it had been buried in cold earth. I felt my palms touching the ground, and a shiver ran through my spine. The ground was cold, wet, as if I were in some kind of underground cave. I didn't know where it was anymore, but I knew I wasn't alone. Suddenly a faint light appeared in the distance, like a flickering flame in the middle of darkness. I couldn't see clearly, but something inside me said I should go there. The fear, which always accompanied me in my life, seemed now a memory at distance, an echo that had no power over me. It was as if something stronger, deeper, was pulling me to that point of light. Each step I took seemed harder than the previous. The feeling of being observed, of being followed, grew with every moment. I did not dare to look back, but something told me that there was something in the shadows. Something waiting for me. Finally, I reached the source of light. It was a small candle, placed on a stone table in the middle of what seemed to be a dark and damp room with walls covered by moss. The environment was strange, as if I was in an abandoned place for centuries, but at the same time, there was something familiar about it, something that made me feel a connection, a connection. The candle trembled, and the smell of melted wax invaded my nostrils. It was then that I saw her. A girl. She was there, beside me, once more. But she was not the same child as before. His eyes were empty, as if he had been taken from somewhere where there was no hope, and his expression was empty, lost. She does not smile. I did not say. But his eyes fixated on me with an intensity one couldn't understand. As if he was waiting for something. As if it was a silent demand. Something was being asked, something I didn't know what it was. I looked around, and as the girl's eyes guided me, I realized that the environment was changing. The shadows began to move, to writhe, as if they were coming alive. I wanted to scream, run, but something stopped me. My body does not respond. I was again paralyzed. It was when the voice came, not as a whisper, but as an order, clear and distinct. You must make the choice. I froze. My heart stopped. What did it do? What choice? What was I being asked to decide? The shadows approached, closing around me. I felt the weight of choice in my chest, the weight of a decision that seemed much greater than anything I had ever faced. And then, in the darkness, a light shone again, stronger, more intense, like a beacon that called me, pulled me. But as that light drew closer, I knew my journey was far from over. Something had changed, something within me was forever transformed. Fear was replaced by a deep understanding, a restricted and silent area that what I had experienced was not the end but only the beginning of something much greater, much more terrible. Whatever it was, I was just starting to find myself. And I knew there was no escape. I would be part of history now, and the cycle would never end. The last thing I heard before everything was gone was the voice of the girl, soft and distant. You will be remembered. And then everything fell apart, as if it had never happened. The darkness swallowed me up again, and history, somehow, continues to be written.